Sir, I need you to move to the seat by the counter, the barista said, her tone cold and unwavering. We need this table for a group of customers arriving soon, and your spot is the only one big enough. The old man looked up from his window seat, the one he chose because the morning light eased the ache in his missing arm. My arm hurts, he said quietly, and I need the sun's warmth. But the young woman didn't soften. I'm sorry, she said. Our policy gives priority to groups. So he stood, gathered his coat, and sat alone in the cold corner of the cafe. 5 minutes later, the door swung open and the manager stepped inside. What he did next changed the meaning of that morning forever. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun was just beginning to thaw the frost that clung to the windows of Milltown, Pennsylvania. It was the kind of winter day that made everything feel a little slower, a little softer. And for Walter Price, those quiet moments mattered more than he'd ever admit. Walter was 78, a man built from quiet strength and the long, slow patience of someone who'd seen enough. He'd lost his left arm halfway down the forearm in Vietnam, a memory he didn't wear like a medal, but like a part of himself that had never really left. The prosthetic he wore was nothing fancy, just a plain, gray composite arm, scuffed in places, but still solid. He didn't mind the cold, not like he used to, but even on the best days, the cold air found its way into the empty space where bone and skin used to be. So that morning, he slipped into the Union Coffee House like he always did, drawn by the promise of warmth and something gentle to start the day. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, a sound that always made him smile, even if just a little. The scent of roasted beans and fresh bread wrapped around him like a memory. He paused for a moment, breathing it in, feeling it settle into the small places in his chest that still hurt when he remembered too much. Walter made his way to his usual table by the window. It wasn't about the view, it was about the light. The sun streamed in just enough to warm the spot where his arm ended and the plastic began, easing the ache that never fully went away. He settled into the chair carefully, the worn wood creaking softly under his weight. His good hand rested on the table's edge, fingers curled around a plain white mug that the barista always seemed to have waiting for him. It was a small kindness, but it meant more than he'd ever say. He wore a faded olive green jacket that had seen more winters than most people cared to remember. A wool cap pulled low over his gray hair, the edges of his ears pink from the cold outside. He looked out the window for a moment, watching the way the morning light danced across the snow, and let himself just be. For a few minutes, that corner of the world was his. The warmth of the sun, the quiet hum of voices around him, the comfort of a cup of coffee held steady in his one good hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Then the door chimed again, and the quiet of the room shifted. A group of 6 tourists walked in, their laughter filling the small cafe like a sudden gust of wind. They wore bright coats and carried the easy confidence of people who'd never had to worry about much at all. Sophie, the young barista, moved quickly to greet them. She was new. Walter had only seen her a few times, but she carried herself like she was trying to prove something. She wore her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her black apron clean and pressed. She took their order with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, glancing over her shoulder at the full tables. Then her eyes landed on Walter, and he felt the shift before she even took a step. The warmth he'd found in the sun seemed to flicker. Just a little. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but cold, like a door clicking shut. She stood beside his table, her posture straight, her fingers tight around the edge of her notepad. "We have a group that needs this table. Could you move to the counter seat? Please." Walter looked up at her, blinking once, then again. He didn't answer right away. He was never quick to speak. Not anymore. Instead, he lifted his prosthetic hand slightly, the gray plastic catching the morning light. "I need the sun," he said quietly. He didn't say it to argue, didn't say it to plead. He said it like a fact, simple and true. Sophie shifted her weight, her polite smile not moving. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone still cold, still firm. Our policy is to give priority to larger groups when the cafe is busy. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes dropping back to his coffee. He took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of it in his chest. Then he shifted his chair back and stood up, the motion careful, measured. He picked up his mug with his one good hand, cradling it close like it was something precious. His shoulders hunched slightly as he moved, the quiet weight of the room pressing down on him. He didn't look at the tourists laughing behind him, didn't look at Sophie's tight smile. He found a small table in the far corner, away from the window, away from the light. It was a dark spot, the kind of place where shadows seemed to settle in and stay. He set his mug down gently, his prosthetic arm resting awkwardly against the edge of the table. He didn't complain. He didn't argue. He just sat there, the lines of his face drawn tight with something he didn't want to name. Across the room, Rebecca Stone watched it all unfold. She sat alone at a small table near the center of the cafe, a half-finished cup of tea in front of her. Her dark green coat was still buttoned up, her soft cream scarf draped loosely around her neck. Her hair fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, and her eyes sharp. Thoughtful followed every quiet movement Walter made. She was a lawyer, the kind who fought for the voices people tried to ignore. And she saw, in that moment, something that went deeper than a seat by the window. She saw the way Walter's shoulders curved in on themselves, the way he kept his gaze low, his breath measured. She saw the quiet way he accepted what was asked of him, even when it cost him a small piece of his dignity, and something in her chest tightened, a quiet fury that she kept hidden behind steady eyes. She watched as the tourists took his old table, their laughter ringing out like it had every right to. She watched as Sophie turned away, already moving on to the next order, the next task, and she watched as Walter sat in the shadows, the warmth of the sun replaced by the chill of a corner no one wanted. For a moment, Rebecca didn't move. She just let herself feel the weight of it, the sharp, quiet injustice that clung to the edges of the room. Then she reached for her phone, her fingers moving with deliberate care. She pulled up a name she hadn't used in years. Daniel Morton, the manager of Union Coffee House. Her message was simple. Direct Daniel. I need you here. There's something you have to see. She hit send, her breath steady, her jaw set. Then she closed her phone and looked back at Walter. He was staring into his coffee cup, his eyes distant, the light gone from his face. But there was still something there, a quiet strength, a refusal to let the cold of that corner swallow him whole. Rebecca knew she couldn't let it stand, not while she was there to see it, not while she still believed that every man, no matter how quiet, deserved a place in the light. And in that moment, as the laughter of the tourists echoed through the warm walls of the Union Coffee House, she made a promise to herself. She would not let this moment pass unnoticed. Not today. Rebecca sat in her chair for a while, her eyes fixed on Walter across the room. She could see every detail, the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way his shoulders curved protectively around the quiet space he'd claimed. She noticed the small scuffs and scratches on the composite prosthetic, the way it rested stiffly on the edge of the table. It wasn't just an object. It was a story of loss and quiet perseverance, of a man who'd learned to carry more than most people would ever understand. She watched him lift the plain white mug to his lips, his motions slow and deliberate, as if each movement was weighed against the memories that haunted him. He didn't glance around the room, didn't seem to notice the tourists who had taken his seat. They were laughing easily, talking over each other like the world had never asked them to sacrifice a thing. Their bright coats and easy smiles filled the window seat with a kind of careless warmth. Walter sat alone in the shadows, his face turned down toward his coffee. There was no anger in his posture, no sign that he wanted to fight back, just a quiet resignation, like he'd long ago accepted that some things in life were not his to keep. Rebecca felt a slow heat build in her chest. She had spent years in courtrooms and conference rooms, fighting battles that most people never even saw. But this was different. This was human, raw, and it settled into her bones like a promise. She reached for her phone again, her fingers steady as she typed out a message. Daniel, it's Rebecca Stone. There's a situation here you need to see. She paused, letting the words sit for a moment. Then she added, this isn't about policy. It's about respect. She hit send, the soft click of the phone sounding like a small exhale in the quiet space around her. Across the room, Walter shifted slightly in his chair. The motion was small, but it carried the weight of a man trying to find comfort where there was none. He ran his hand once along the edge of the table, his fingertips brushing against the worn wood. Rebecca's eyes softened as she watched him. She saw how carefully he cradled the coffee mug, how his shoulders lifted and fell with a slow, steady rhythm. She knew that kind of weight. She knew how it pressed down, quiet and constant. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, each step quiet on the old wooden floor. The murmur of the coffee shop seemed to fade around her, the laughter of the tourists a distant echo she refused to hear. When she reached Walter's table, she paused for a moment, gathering her breath. Then she laid her hand gently on his shoulder. Her touch was light but steady, a soft anchor in the swirl of noise and bright colors. Mr. Price, she said, her voice low and even. You don't deserve this. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was a flicker of surprise in them, then a tired smile that didn't quite reach the corners of his mouth. Ma'am, he said softly, his voice rough but kind. You don't need to worry about me. Rebecca shook her head, her hand still resting on his shoulder. It's not about worry, she said. It's about what's right. Walter's smile faded just a little, and he let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting a long time to be released. I've been through worse, he said quietly. His fingers tapped once against the side of the coffee mug. It's just a seat. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her voice soft but firm. It's never just a seat, she said. Not when it costs a man his dignity. Walter didn't argue. He just looked at her for a long moment, then lowered his gaze back to the coffee in front of him. I appreciate it, he murmured, but I've learned not to expect much. His voice was calm, but there was a hollow ring to the words that cut deeper than she expected. Rebecca let her hand drop to her side, but she didn't step away. She glanced at the window seat, where the tourists were still talking, still oblivious to the small storm they'd stirred in the quiet of the cafe. Then she turned back to Walter, her jaw set. You shouldn't have to expect less, she said softly. Not after everything you've given. Walter didn't answer right away. He traced the rim of his mug with his finger, the soft scrape of nail against ceramic, a quiet counterpoint to the laughter across the room. Finally, he looked up at her again, his eyes tired but clear. I don't need special treatment, he said. I just want to be treated like any other man. Rebecca nodded once, her expression softening. And that's exactly what I'm going to make sure happens, she said. Her voice was calm, but underneath it was a quiet resolve that felt like steel. Walter gave her a small, grateful nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She turned and walked back to her table, her shoulders straight, her mind already working through what needed to be done. The tourists at the window seat didn't notice her. They didn't notice Walter neither. They laughed and talked, their words bright and careless in the warm light. But Rebecca noticed. She saw the way Walter's hand rested on the edge of the table, his thumb brushing absently over the scratches in the wood. She saw the way his shoulders lifted and fell, each breath a quiet testament to the years he'd carried alone. She didn't open her laptop. Instead, she watched him, her phone resting on the table in front of her, waiting for the reply she knew would come, because some things couldn't be ignored, and some people deserved to be seen. The coffee shop around them buzzed with low conversation and the soft hiss of the espresso machine. But for Rebecca, the only sound that mattered was the quiet strength of the man in the corner, and the promise she had made to herself. She would not let him be forgotten, not while she was there to see. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed softly against the table. She glanced down and saw the name she'd been waiting for, Daniel Morton. His reply was short, but it was enough. On my way. Rebecca let out a slow breath, her fingers curling around the edge of the phone. Then she looked back at Walter, her eyes soft but unwavering. He didn't look up, but she could see the slow, steady rhythm of his breath, the quiet dignity that no one else in the room seemed to understand. She knew she couldn't change the past. She couldn't take away the years of quiet endurance, the battles fought in the silence of long nights and early mornings. But she could make sure that in this moment, this small, sunlit cafe he was seeing, he was honored. And as she watched him lift his coffee cup again, the light catching on the smooth gray plastic of his prosthetic, she felt a quiet promise settle into her bones. She wouldn't let this be just another morning. Not for him, not for the man who had given so much and asked for so little. Daniel arrived at the Union Coffee House just as Rebecca's phone went dark again, her final message sent. He pushed open the door with a quiet determination, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on her. His salt and pepper hair was still dusted with snow, his navy cardigan buttoned up tight against the cold. He moved across the cafe with the slow, measured steps of a man who carried responsibility in his bones. Rebecca rose to meet him halfway, her expression calm but resolute. Daniel gave her a small nod, his brow furrowed with the kind of worry that only deepened when he saw the tired man sitting alone in the corner. "What's going on, Rebecca?" he asked quietly, his voice low so it wouldn't carry to the rest of the room. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady and sure. "There's a man sitting over there named Walter Price. He's a veteran. He lost half his left arm at Quezon, and he's been quietly coming here for years." Daniel glanced over his shoulder, his eyes following hers to where Walter sat, the composite prosthetic resting on the edge of the table. He frowned, a flicker of something like guilt crossing his face. "I didn't know," he said softly. Rebecca's jaw tightened, her voice firm. "That's not the point," she said. "The point is he was asked to move for a group of tourists who wanted to sit together, and he did without a word of complaint." Daniel's lips parted, but he didn't speak. He looked down at his hands, then back at Walter. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I need you to see it for what it is," she said. "It's not about a table or a policy. It's about respect, about making sure a man like him doesn't get pushed aside because he doesn't speak up." Daniel swallowed hard, his shoulders straightening as he let the weight of her words settle in. He took a slow breath, then nodded. "Show me," he said simply. She pulled out her phone and held it up, the screen glowing softly between them. On it was an old newspaper clipping yellowed around the edges, but still clear enough to read. The headline was simple: "Local Marine awarded Silver Star for heroic actions in Quezon." Daniel took the phone, his eyes scanning the lines slowly. The story of a man who had carried more than anyone should ever have to. When he looked up again, his eyes were softer, his voice low and careful. "I didn't know," he said again. But this time, there was something different in the way he said it. Something that said he was ready to make it right. Rebecca gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then let's do it," she said. She stepped back, giving him room to move forward, to take the lead. The cafe had grown quieter as the minutes slipped by, the hum of conversation turning to a hush that seemed to hang in the air. Even Sophie, standing behind the counter, was watching, her face pale and stricken as she realized the weight of what she'd done. The tourists at the window had stopped laughing, their bright coats suddenly seeming out of place in the heavy stillness. Daniel walked slowly to Walter's table, every step deliberate. When he reached him, he didn't stand over him like a man in charge. He knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to Walter's level. "Mr. Price," he said quietly, his voice carrying enough weight that even the tourists turned to listen. "I owe you an apology." Walter looked up, his one good hand wrapped around the warm ceramic of his coffee cup. His eyes were steady, tired but calm, and he didn't flinch from Daniel's gaze. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. Daniel shook his head, his face open and earnest. "I do," he said, his voice thick. "I didn't know your story, and that's my failing. This place your seat, it's yours whenever you need it. Always." The words hung in the air for a moment, quiet and heavy. Sophie's eyes flickered with shame, and the tourists looked down at their cups, their laughter gone silent. The whole room seemed to breathe in unison, the hush deep and solemn. Walter took a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just a little. He lifted his head, meeting Daniel's eyes with a faint, weary smile. "I don't need special treatment," he said quietly, his voice even. "I just want to be treated like any other man." Daniel's eyes shone with something close to regret. His lips pressed into a thin line. "And that's what you'll have," he said, his voice firm. "No exceptions. No more questions." For a moment, neither man moved. They just sat there in the quiet, the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic in the background, the low murmur of the heater. It was a small, simple moment, but one that felt bigger than anything else in the room. Rebecca watched from a few feet away, her hands resting on the back of a chair, her eyes soft but unyielding. She saw the way Walter's shoulders lifted, the way his chin came up just a fraction. It wasn't defiance, it was something quieter, something closer to relief. The tourists shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Walter and Daniel. One of them, a young man in a bright red jacket, stood up slowly, his face pink with something like shame. He didn't say anything, just picked up his cup and walked to the counter, giving Walter a small, respectful nod as he passed. Sophie stepped forward from behind the counter, her voice low and careful. "Mr. Price," she said softly, her eyes bright. "I'm sorry. I didn't understand." Walter didn't smile, but he nodded once, a quiet gesture of forgiveness that seemed to ease the tension in the room. Daniel took a slow breath and stood up, his shoulders straight. He turned back to the cafe, his eyes meeting each patron in turn, his voice calm but certain. "This man has given enough," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "And in this place, he will be honored. Always." The words settled into the warm wood and soft light of the cafe, sinking deep. No one argued. No one looked away. Walter let out a slow breath, his shoulders settling back as he lifted his mug once more. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he didn't seem to mind. For the first time that morning, he looked out the window with something close to peace in his eyes. Rebecca stepped forward then, her voice soft but filled with quiet pride. "And that's all any of us ever want," she said gently. "To be seen, to be known, to be treated with the dignity we've earned." Walter looked at her, his expression calm, and he nodded once. A small, weary smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And as the cafe slowly came back to life, the gentle hum of voices and the soft clink of cups filling the silence, Walter sat back in his chair, the light from the window soft on his face. He didn't need the words. He didn't need the applause. He just needed this, a quiet place in the sun and the simple respect of being seen. Rebecca stood beside Walter, her presence like a quiet shield. Her eyes were bright with something fierce, something unyielding. "And that's what you've always deserved, Mr. Price," she said softly. Her voice carried across the small cafe, a gentle weight that settled in every corner. The words seemed to echo in the quiet, weaving themselves into the worn wood and warm light. Walter didn't answer, but the faintest smile touched his lips, a small flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. For a moment, everything was still, the low murmur of conversation, the clink of cups, even the soft hum of the old radiator. It all seemed to pause. And then, quietly, a young man in a bright red jacket stood up from the window seat. He didn't look at his friends, didn't say a word. He just took a breath and walked over to Walter's table. There was a flush in his cheeks, and his hands were tight around the empty coffee cup he carried. When he reached Walter, he paused. His eyes met the older man's, steady and full of something like apology. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "This seat, it's yours to, sir." He stepped back, leaving the chair by the window empty once more. The light fell across it, warm and gentle, as if it had been waiting all along. Walter looked at the young man for a moment, then nodded once, slow and deliberate, and he rose from his chair in the dark corner, moving with the careful precision of a man who had learned not to waste his strength. Rebecca stepped back to give him room, her eyes never leaving his face. She watched as he picked up his coffee mug, the motion steady and measured. When he reached the window seat, he paused for a moment. The light fell across his shoulders, turning the gray plastic of his prosthetic into something quiet and strong. He settled into the chair, his back straight, his shoulders square. The warmth of the sun wrapped around him, soft and unassuming. He closed his eyes for a moment, just breathing it in. Then he opened them again and looked out the window, his gaze calm and steady. He took a sip of his coffee, the warmth of it grounding him in the present. For the first time that morning, there was no tension in the lines of his face, no tightness in the set of his jaw. Around him, the café seemed to exhale. The soft hum of conversation returned, gentle and respectful. People glanced his way, but their eyes were different now, filled with quiet respect, not pity. Sophie moved behind the counter, her face pale but determined. She wiped her hands on a cloth, then met Walter's eyes across the room. There was no apology in her voice, just a quiet promise that she would remember. Rebecca watched it all, her heart steady in her chest. She knew this wasn't about a single moment or a single seat. It was about the way we choose to see each other, even in the small and the unquiet spaces of our lives. Walter didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just sat there, the morning light soft on his face, his coffee warm in his good hand. The young man who had given up the seat lingered nearby for a moment, as if he wanted to say more. But in the end, he just nodded to Walter and returned to his friends, his shoulders a little straighter than before. Sometimes respect didn't need words. Daniel stood near the counter, his expression calm and thoughtful. He met Rebecca's eyes and gave her a small nod, a silent thank you, a quiet acknowledgement of what she had done. She returned it with a faint smile, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that morning. She knew that this wasn't the end, that the world would keep turning, that tomorrow would bring its own battles and burdens. But for today, this small act of dignity reclaimed was enough. She looked back at Walter, the quiet lines of his face eased by the light. He sat like a monument in that small corner of the world, not a relic, not a burden, but a man. A man who had given enough, a man who deserved to be seen, a man who had been returned to the light. The tourists who had once filled the window seats spoke in hushed voices now, their laughter soft and careful. Rebecca could see the way they glanced at Walter, the way their eyes seemed to linger just a moment longer. They had been part of this story too, whether they knew it or not. In the warm glow of the morning, Walter took another sip of his coffee. He didn't hurry, didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the moment settle around him, let the light warm the tired ache in his shoulder. Rebecca sat back down, her own coffee growing cold in front of her. But she didn't mind. She was content to watch him, to know that for now, this small patch of light and warmth was his alone. And as the minutes slipped by, as the quiet comfort of the café folded around them, she felt something ease in her chest. This wasn't just about a seat by the window. It was about the quiet, unspoken promise that no man should ever be asked to surrender his dignity. In that soft golden light, Walter was no longer a man set apart in the shadows. He was a reminder of what it meant to see someone, to truly see them. And in that simple act of recognition, there was honor. The laughter of the tourists returned, but it was softer now, edged with a kind of reverence. Sophie moved with more care behind the counter, her eyes lingering on Walter whenever she passed. Daniel's posture was easier, his face open and calm. And Walter, he sat there, his shoulders straight, his eyes turned to the world outside the window. The sun caught the edge of his prosthetic, turning it into something quiet and strong. Rebecca knew there would be other mornings, other quiet battles to be fought. But for today, in this small cafe, something had been restored, something precious, something that no one had the right to take away. In the gentle hush of that winter morning, Walter Price was seen, not as a burden, not as a relic, but as a man, a quiet testament to the dignity that never fades, no matter how many winters pass. And as she watched him sit there, bathed in the warmth of the sun, Rebecca understood. Sometimes it only takes a moment, a quiet stand, a gentle word, a seat returned to remind the world that every man's story matters, especially when that story is his own. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.